Hello, and welcome to Pinot for PNOC, a virtual wine tasting and fundraiser to benefit pediatric brain cancer.
Bruce and Alan Campbell here, co-founders of PNOC Foundation. Today we get to combine three of our great passions: improving the treatments and outcomes for kids and their families fighting pediatric brain cancer, connecting with you all, our PNOC community, and of course, drinking some great wine. So we're especially grateful that you can join us today to raise a glass or three for this great cause. To our existing PNOC community, you've all been in our hearts and minds. We've missed seeing you in person, but we're delighted so many of you can join us here today. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. Over the next 60 minutes, you'll learn about the important work of PNOC and meet pediatric brain surgeon Dr. Nalan Gupta. But the emphasis today will be to learn all about the delicious and critically acclaimed wines of DONO Estate and meet DONO's winemaker, Dan Fishman, for our virtual tasting. So if you've ever wanted to ask questions of a brain surgeon and a winemaker over a glass of wine, today could be a chance. For those of you we haven't met, we were reluctantly inducted into the pediatric brain tumor community back in 2010, when our then 6-year-old son, George, after only a week of symptoms, was diagnosed with a life-threatening brain tumor the size of a small lemon behind his right eye. Within hours of that first scan, we were admitted into the pediatric ICU ward at UCSF, and within days, George underwent a life-saving 9.5-hour brain surgery. The post-operative biopsy results revealed George's tumor type to be a highly aggressive, malignant grade 3 anaplastic ependymoma, and our futures were really uncertain.
It's been a long journey, but we're grateful to say that we hit a significant milestone this week. Our son George had his 10-year MRI brain scan, and the image results confirmed that he has no tumor reoccurrence or damage progression, something Bruce and I will definitely be celebrating today. We've heard from our doctors on a scale of 1 to 10, George's results are an 11. We know we're incredibly fortunate, and we want to see more kids have the same or better outcomes. So in preparation for our wine tasting, if you've submitted questions beforehand, we've incorporated them into the conversation. If you'd like to ask a question or let us know where you're joining from, use the chat button. We'd love to hear from you. If you've purchased wine to taste along, we suggest that you open your bottles now and get your stemware ready. If you haven't purchased your wine, you still can take advantage of purchasing those curated wine sets through July 31st. Also, as a registered participant, you get exclusive Member for the Day benefits, access to wines normally available to members only, such as the highly rated reserve and library wines, and the pre-release access to the inaugural vintage of the Blanc de Blanc sparkling wine. A heartfelt thanks to our special friends at DONO Estate for extending these benefits and kindly donating a portion of the PNOC wine set sales.
It's a privilege to introduce our first guest. Dr. Nalan Gupta is the Chief of Pediatric Neurological Surgery at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital and Principal Investigator of the Brain Tumor Research Center at UCSF. Dr. Gupta holds a very special place in our hearts, for it was he who performed the life-saving 9.5-hour brain surgery on our son George 10 years ago this week. Dr. Gupta, always an honor. Can you believe it's been 10 years since that surgery? You haven't aged a day, mate.
Likewise. We look great, right?
I wonder if you could. Yeah, I wonder. I've got the same hairstyle as you now. I wonder if you could actually take our audience through just a brief overview of the current landscape for pediatric brain cancer, the importance of your work, and the efforts of PNOC.
Of course, and I just wanted to extend my thanks to all the participants, those of you that have joined today. I appreciate the time and effort. This is actually, a tremendous opportunity for us to interact in this way. I realize things are very different in the world right now, but we are doing our work, and we can't do it without your help and participation. So pediatric brain tumors actually are rare. They're rare diseases, and all tumors in children, by definition, are rare. They, however, are the leading cause of mortality from cancer in children in the world. And that's a challenge to us. And the reason for that is that the commoner tumors of leukemia and lymphoma, they've been a success story, relatively speaking, in the last 10, 20 years. And our challenge really is to make that success translated into pediatric brain tumors. There are many different kinds, and some of them still have very poor prognosis in terms of outcome and disability. So how are we going to solve this problem? And this problem comes to us and is around the world. And the way that we're going to do it is really through organizations like PNOC. It is a consortium. It is a consortium that involves collaboration. Collaboration because not only do one site in one place, it's very difficult to study a disease as rare as this like that, but as a group, we can bring and pool together our patients so that we can actually run clinical trials that are meaningful. The other important reason for collaboration, of course, is to bring the best minds together. We don't have a monopoly at one place in terms of ideas. And if we can work together, we can hopefully find a cure for this disease. PNOC includes and started with institutions on the West Coast, but now includes 18 institutions across North America, as well as several new institutions in Europe, Asia, and Australia. Data is shared on an open platform so that all investigators and scientists can take that data and move it forward. The second pillar of PNOC is really technology, is using technology that has been developed and is under development to focus on this problem. This is a shot of an intraoperative MRI in our operating theater, and that's what you see in the background. Patients during surgery can be directly wheeled into the MR, and we can get high quality imaging as we're operating. And that can guide us in terms of not only doing surgery, but developing new strategies. So that technology that we use to not only help us do surgery is also can be used to deliver therapeutics. So one of the problems with brain tumors is simply getting the drugs and chemotherapy into the brain in an effective concentration. One of the tools we're using is something called convection-enhanced delivery, and this is a way of placing catheters directly into a tumor. This is an MRI scan from a patient who has a catheter placed directly into the brainstem, and the white area that you see is actually a marker of a drug that's being used to directly treat the tumor in the center part of the brainstem. And that technology has been really something that's been developed over the last handful of years, and we hope that that's going to really allow us to be much more targeted and selective. The next major area that PNOC has been pioneering and using is really something that people talk about called personalized medicine. What does that mean? Personalized medicine is really using the tissue. In this case, you're seeing a biopsy of a patient with a brainstem tumor, using that tissue to really characterize a tumor in great detail. For generations, we've classified tumors in broad categories, but now we understand that these tumors are actually families of tumors that are unique and individual, and they respond in different ways to different kinds of treatment. By also using advanced genetics and genomics techniques that allow us to characterize these tumors, we can actually identify features that we hope are going to be able to target them. This is just a figure from a paper from one of the PNOC studies, early ones, that biopsy patients with brainstem tumors, and then we sequenced the entire genome of each of those tumors and then identified pathways that were abnormal. And the figure on the left really just shows even those tumors that look very much the same, they actually had very different pathways that were activated. And based on that information, we were able to select treatments that we hope are going to be individualized for those patients. So it's really the combination of collaboration, technology, personalized medicine that we hope is going to give us success in the future. I just want to close by acknowledging something that's really important, and it's relevant to all of you today. PNOC is a consortium that obviously there are scientists and doctors that are devising new techniques and tools, but it's a consortium that's funded by philanthropy. It's funded by people just like yourself, and the trials that we have done and are doing are also funded by industry, but they're really the work of a small group of very dedicated people. And this is the operations team at UCSF that's responsible for collecting the data, running the trials, and making sure that we obtain information. Annette is our biostatistician with PNOC. And I haven't included all the participants at the different sites, But I just wanted to recognize and call out the operations group because they're really the ones, the heart and soul, that make the PNOC consortium work and function. And it's really the efforts of that group that makes it all happen. So I wanted to give you that overview just so you understand where we're coming from. It's PNOC's been around for several years, and we hope to be around for a lot longer, at least until we find a cure. And we're working very hard to achieve that. Thank you for your time today.
Dr. Gupta, we're so grateful for all that you and your colleagues have done and continue to do in this important field. I wonder if I can convince you to hang around with us and co-host our wine tasting with DONO's winemaker, Dan Fishman.
Well, you twist my arm, so yeah, it'd be a pleasure.
To our audience at home, if at any time during today's virtual wine tasting you'd like to make a donation, you can do so by texting to give to the number on your screen below. Just simply type the word give along with your donation amount. PNOC Foundation is a registered public charity. All donations are 100% tax deductible. And we've received a generous matching pledge that for every dollar donated during today's tasting will be matched by an anonymous donor. So with that, let's talk about DONO. So recently recognized by Wine Spectator as one of Sonoma's top producers with its consistent and impressive 90+ scores, DONO Estate is being increasingly recognized for its single vineyard Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays sourced exclusively from their estate vineyards in the Carneros, Anderson Valley, and Russian River Valley. Dan, welcome, and thanks for joining and taking us through today's tasting.
Thanks so much. I wanted to say just off the top, Bruce and Alan and Dr. Gupta, thank you so much from me and from everyone at DONO for letting us be a part of this great cause. It's really an honor to be part of it, and I'm really excited to be here. Selfishly, I'm excited to taste the wines with Dr. Gupta. I think that's going to be really interesting to hear his expert take, and I'm very, very honored to be here. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm Dan Fishman. I'm the winemaker at DONO Estate. So for those who might not be familiar with DONO or even with Sonoma wine country, I wanted to give you a little bit of background before we get into the tasting. So we're in Sonoma County. So we're about 45 minutes north of San Francisco. Carneros is our home region, and there's a great shot. So Carneros is these first rolling hills that kind of come right up out of the bay, out of San Pablo Bay. And so it's a very kind of a coastal climate. And that's what makes it such a perfect place for us to grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Our focus is on Pinot, but we do a little bit of Chardonnay as well, and we'll be tasting that. So DONO was founded about 20 years ago. And over that time, we've kind of developed the vineyards, developed our style, and I think really, set ourselves apart in the region. We're really focused 100% on quality, on growing the best grapes that we can. And also making just this amazing experience. As you'll see from some of the videos, we have an incredible sculpture collection on the property as well. So it really is a full experience. We talk about kind of integrating the land, the wine, and the art together. And for me, that's what separates great wine, is that it really expresses the land in which it's grown. So that's really our focus. And so we're farming organically and with some biodynamic principles. So I think that's really important, is just being good stewards. We're really trying to set this up as a long-term project, really thinking about having this, obviously in Europe, the wineries have this amazing long history, and we're just starting out in California. So the owners of DONO, Alan and May Warburg, really have kind of a long-term vision and I think a beautiful vision. So I'm really excited to try the wines with you. The first wine will be the 2019 Estate Rosé. So this is from our home vineyard. So we're 100% estate, which means that we own all of our vineyards. We farm them ourselves. We harvest the grapes. We make the wine. It's all in-house. And so I think rosé is kind of an interesting place to start. I think in some ways, California rosé has gotten a little bit of a bad rap. I think there's some reasons for that. Sometimes rosé can be a little bit too sweet. Ours is totally dry, so you won't have that issue. And the other factor that I think is interesting to discuss is how rosé is made. So I think everybody kind of intuitively knows one of the differences between white and red wine, which is, of course, white grapes and red grapes. The other major difference is how they're processed. And so typically with white wine, you bring in the grapes, you press them, and you ferment the juice only. And then with red wines, you bring in the grapes and you ferment the juice and the grape skins all together. And that's what gives it its color and texture. And so rosé is red grapes, but processed like a white wine. And here's some video of me in our rosé block right there. So what that means is that we pick red grapes and we press them and we ferment just the juice. So that's what gives it this kind of beautiful pale color. It just has a little bit of time in contact with the skins. And I think that second aspect is that rosé can be made kind of as a byproduct of red wine, where people will just take a little bit of juice from their red wine and turn it into rosé. And I don't think that gives you the result you're looking for. Typically, a red wine harvest is later in the season and riper. And for rosé, you really want something light and fresh and picked a little bit earlier. So we farm specifically for rosé, and we pick with the intention of making rosé. So this will be our first pick. We're actually only a couple weeks away. So sorry, I don't want to bore everyone by talking too much. Let's taste the wine. And Dr. Gupta, let's hear your thoughts on it as well. So for me, when I'm tasting rosé, of course, the first thing is I'm going to look at the color. Looking, especially for a Pinot Noir rosé, you want something very light, very delicate. And then first thing is give it a little sniff. For rosé, I think you're kind of looking for elements of white wine and red wine in the glass, and that's what I hope to see. Maybe some cherry, some cranberry from the red side of things, and then some apple or pear, something like a white wine spectrum. So that's what I'm hoping for. Are you tasting anything like that, Nolan?
Yeah, no, I think I think actually rosés are among my wife's favorite wines, and I think we both like it because it doesn't hit you as like you if you get a real rich red, it kind of fills your palate, and then that's all you taste. But in this one, you're kind of tasting it. It doesn't linger for a long time. So I'm actually kind of curious as to why is it, or do you design that in terms of when you make a wine, that length of that flavor, is that something you have control over when you make it? Like a rosé, this rosé has a really nice, delicate flavor that doesn't sort of sit there for a long period of time.
Yeah, I think as compared to some other rosés, I think that being a dry wine instead of having a little bit of sugar really affects that. I think that's exactly what I don't like about a sweet rosé, is that it's kind of cloying and it kind of sits on the palate with this very heavy texture from the sugar. And so I think what we're looking for is exactly that, a very clean, dry finish. The kind of wine that when you're having a meal with it, you have a sip, it makes you want more food. You have some food, it makes you want another sip of the wine. Really just that freshness and brightness. So I'm happy that you're experiencing that, because that's exactly what we're looking for.
Well, actually, the food part is an important one because obviously, I actually think that rosés pair better with food, not in general, than I think, you don't have to work as hard, I think, with a rosé and food, particularly if it's not, like a heavy kind of meat-based dinner, then it seems like it fits better with food. And is that something that is that a reason why you guys picked rosé, or is that just something that I'm actually curious why you chose rosé as something to make?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It really does open up, I think, another realm of food pairing when we've got our Chardonnay and then our Pinots. It does kind of limit you a little bit, and we like to do sort of a paired dinner, say 5 courses each with a different wine. And the rosé is really that versatile wine that can go with I love it. Say, like, oftentimes I've seen chefs do sort of like some kind of raw fish, raw tuna, crudo type of thing. And I think it works really well there kind of early in the meal. And then I've also seen it later in the meal, maybe with a cheese course or something. So it really does have that versatility. And so that's definitely one reason we do it. Another reason that we've started making a little more rosé is that we have quite a bit of younger vines on our property. And younger vines can make a really nice wine, but it's hard to get the type of depth and concentration that we're looking for in our Pinot from a younger vine. And so by picking for rosé, we have a way to use the fruit from the younger vines and really take advantage of it. And I think make something with a lot of depth and complexity in its own way. But you're also, as I was saying, picking this maybe 3 to 4 weeks earlier than you would for a red wine. So it doesn't stress the young vines as much because you get the fruit off earlier in the season and kind of let them continue just with the vegetative growth. So it's a little bit of a, for me, happy thing because I love rosé, but it's also a way to use some of that younger vine fruit that isn't quite ready for our red wines.
Now you guys focus on Pinots and Chardonnay. Can you make rosé with, I mean, like other varietals as well, or has rosé typically been a Pinot-based wine?
I think actually more often made with other red grapes. Of course, White Zinfandel being the California starter.
Yeah.
You can make a rosé from any red grape. Some very dark-skinned grapes, it's harder because it will pick up color so quickly that you don't get very much juice out of the grape before it starts turning into more of a light red wine than a rosé. So Pinot being kind of thinner skinned and lighter colored is a good one for rosé. But I think, sort of as I was alluding to before, people have taken to using sort of extra juice from their red ferments to make rosé out of instead of picking it for rosé. And I think that's really critical to make a Pinot Noir rosé specifically. It needs to be harvested with that intention and earlier on. So this is about 12.5% alcohol. So kind of on the lighter side. So you could do it with any red.
That actually brings up a question I had, is how that alcohol content, obviously, I know you guys, the sugar that you start with, the sugar in the grape plays a big role in terms of that. Do you guys, do you like to aim for a particular target for your alcohol? And is that kind of like where you find that it doesn't overwhelm the rosé at that lower point, that lower alcohol content?
Yeah, definitely. And so that's exactly it. So the sugar in the grapes goes up as they ripen through the season, and the more sugar you have, the more alcohol in the finished product. So that's exactly why we're picking it earlier on. And also acidity goes down as the grapes ripen. So it's a combination of the two factors. So when we pick mostly based on taste. So we'll be out in the field tasting the grapes and kind of deciding whether they're ready or not. And so with the rosé, it's really exactly that, trying to make sure we get it at a point where we still have the acidity, the freshness, and exactly that, the lower alcohol to keep it fresh on the palate and stop it from overwhelming. Because that's another thing that creates heaviness besides sugar is high alcohol.
Right.
Well, should we send it back to Bruce and Alan for another check-in and then come back to the Chardonnay?
We definitely got a few viewers saying that they're really enjoying the rosé. So thank you very much, Dan, for your talents. It has a beautiful nose too. It really does. I think we've got a question that just came in.
We've got a couple of questions actually. So one for you, Dan, first. And the question is, PNOC is global. Did you have any formative experience as a winemaker outside of the US?
I did. Only one, not as much as I would like to have had, but I did do in 2008. After my first harvest in California, I went to New Zealand and did a harvest there at a fairly large winery in Marlborough, mostly Sauvignon Blanc, but they did do a little bit of Pinot Noir as well. So that was a really interesting experience and a chance to see something totally different.
And then a question for Nala.
This is actually from Brad in Maine. He says, how does UCSF share its molecular tumor board decisions, logic, options, rationale, and confidence with other patients and oncologists and other institutions and progress? So real specific to the question.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Nothing to do with wine, but yeah, we the tumor board and have evolved. Tumor boards are really discussions between specialists for specific cases, and we review cases that are sent to us from various places around the country, and we will generate a report, and that report goes back to either the physician or the patients that want it. Obviously, we can't review every patient that in the country, but one of the things that we actually tried to do with one of the PNOC trials was actually to build a structure for how to actually analyze the data that we're getting. Part of the problem, and this is true in broadly outside of medicine as well, is that there's so much data, understanding and developing strategies to analyze it and get meaningful answers out of it. That was actually one of the goals of the PNOC 003 study, was actually to develop a structure exactly for that. And that structure is something that we share openly with all the PNOC sites, and it's published and it's available. So I think part of it is the individual patient discussion, which I think we try to be as open as possible in terms of the physicians outside of UCSF and within the center. But then the bigger thing is how do you create pathways and a process for analyzing data and information that anybody can use. And that's a work in progress. And I think that's something that is going to be a focus for many groups in the next 5 to 10 years, is understanding how to take the data and make it into a relevant clinical decision.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we want to take a moment and actually acknowledge a few generous donors. We've got Dr. Michael and Linda Prados for their $25,000 matching gift. Trish and family and Marin, Graham and Cindy in their backyard vineyard guests in Cincinnati. Darren and Shannon in Los Angeles. Jimmy G in Pennsylvania. Robert in New York. Shelley in Oregon. John and Judy in San Francisco. And then we also got a new donation that just came in from Mary Ann. So thank you so much for your generous donation. We have friends and supporters in California. We've got Diane and Kevin, Michelle and Eric, Linda and Bruce, Amy, Wesley. And then, wow, I think that we just got another one in. We've received a very generous $30,000 donation from Chris and Jill in Palm Beach.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. So incredibly generous. I got to say, I'm very sad to be moving on from the Rosé, Dan, but we're going to throw it back to you to move on to the Chardonnay.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so we're moving now to the 2017 Russian River Chardonnay. So I talked a little bit about Carneros, which is where our home estate and our main property with the art collection is. We also have we have a couple other vineyards, only this one that's producing right now, though. So this is in the Russian River Valley, so a little bit north of Carneros, about an hour away. Russian River Valley, of course, is kind of famous for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Some of the earliest pioneers in California Pinot and Chard were based in the Russian River, and there's a great shot of the vineyard. So this area is a little bit warmer than Carneros, still obviously needs to be on the cooler side. And that's something maybe to mention, is that the reason why we do Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is they're the two grapes from Burgundy. And of course, Burgundy being a little bit of a cooler region, we're looking for some of the cooler subregions within Sonoma County to grow Pinot and Chardonnay, and that's where our vineyards are. So this vineyard was planted in 1997. It's mostly Pinot Noir, but we do have a little bit of Chardonnay, and the soil is this really nice, sandy, lighter soil, which I think is perfect for Chardonnay. One thing that I think is interesting to mention is that I often get the response from people that will say, I don't really like California Chardonnay, but I like yours. And I think the reason for that is that we make it a little bit differently than the normal way. So a lot of Chardonnay will go through primary fermentation, which is where the yeast converts sugar into alcohol. So that could happen in a tank or in a barrel. We do all barrel fermented Chardonnay. But after the primary fermentation, there is a secondary fermentation that can occur, which is called malolactic fermentation. And so that's a conversion by bacteria of malic acid into lactic acid. So malic being kind of like the acid you have in an apple, it's sharper, and then lactic being like the acid in milk, which is softer. And so what that does is it softens the palate, and it also is what leads to buttery flavors when that occurs. And so I think a lot of people who aren't as big a fan of Chardonnay in California don't really appreciate that richness and that buttery flavor. So what we do is we actually prevent the wine from going through malolactic fermentation. So you have all that malic acid, which really keeps the wine brighter, sharper, and avoids any of that buttery flavor. So that's kind of what I look for when I'm tasting our Chardonnays. We have a little bit of richness from the oak fermentation, still got plenty of body, but it's not flabby or fat, and it's not buttery. Are you experiencing that, Nolan, or anything?
I'm going to take a sip. The smell though is very subtle. It's not like actually it seems less than even the rosé, in terms of the nose of it. It's just a very subtle flavor to it.
Yeah, definitely. Chardonnay is actually an interesting grape because it doesn't have a strong varietal character. Some grapes, like I think like Pinot, for example, or Cabernet Sauvignon, have a very strong kind of one taste that you're going to get with Pinot, kind of like whether it's a red or a black fruit, but a lot of fruit. Cabernet has that kind of bell pepper, a little bit of that greenness that you can kind of pick out. Chardonnay does not have like a really distinct varietal character like that. And I think that's what you're getting on the nose. Maybe some little notes for me of like lemon and apple, and then a little bit from the wood. So we use a little bit of new oak, so you get a little bit of a toastiness from that. But yeah, definitely kind of subtle. And I think maybe it kind of surprises on the palate because there is quite a bit of weight there on the palate for me.
Yeah. Is that, I notice it's smooth, like it kind of has a smooth character to it. Is that something that is a function of the lack of that second malolactic step, or is that what gives it that kind of smooth kind of character? It has a little bit of a different feel than the rosé we just had.
I actually think that is mainly due to the aging. And so what I didn't mention on the rosé is that's fermented, and then we bottle it just about 3 or 4 months later. So that was the 2019 rosé. So it's really not in barrel for a very long time.
Oh.
With the Chardonnay, it's fermented in barrel, and then as the fermentation finishes, the yeast dies off, and it creates this layer of solids on the bottom, which we call the lees. And as the wine ages on the lees, that's what gives it that softer mouthfeel and that real smoothness. So our Chardonnay, some people will bottle after 10 months. We actually go a full year and a half, so 16 months in the barrel, aging on the lees. It's never disturbed, so it just sits there kind of developing and maturing. And that I think that maturation time is what really gives it that smoothness. So I think that is actually a function of the age.
Can you talk a little bit about the barrel? Like, and I know that sounds like a goofy question, but like the selection of the barrel in terms of its impact on, the wine and the flavor of the wine?
Yeah, that's not a goofy question at all. It's actually something that we spend a lot of time working on. So barrels can be made from any wood, I imagine, but for wine, generally it's oak, especially for higher end wine. Sometimes you can make barrels out of acacia or other woods, but for kind of high end wine, it's made out of oak, and then where that oak comes from makes a big difference. So you can grow oak in America, mostly on the East Coast. You can grow oak in many places in Europe, but the best oak, the finest oak, comes from France. And these are forests that have been actually managed for hundreds of years, specifically for making barrels from. So they really have it down to a science, literally. And that's what gives it the flavor profile. So we work with different cooperages, so different people making the barrels. And then within that, we work with wood that's specifically from different forests. So some of them are quite small, some of them a little bit larger, but each forest has its own flavor profile. And then to make it more complicated, each barrel can be toasted to different degrees. So we work with different levels of toast, different wood origins, and different coopers, all within French oak, not to mention that there's a whole world of oak out there beyond that. So it is actually something that we spend a lot of months on kind of in the early winter. My associate winemaker, Tony, and I taste through every barrel at least 3 times. And we evaluate and say, is this barrel the right match for this vineyard or not? And so we kind of take notes, look at that, and every year come back. So it is actually a big consideration, and it has a huge impact, especially on the Chardonnay. So that's a real focus.
When people say the Chardonnay is overly oaked or too oaky, does that mean like that balance of finding the right oak or toasting it is kind of, they probably made a decision or went too far in one direction?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that can be a few factors. So barrels actually only really impart a lot of flavor when they're new. So the first time you fill them, that we call that a new barrel. After that, it's a neutral or once used or whatever. But each use diminishes the impact, but really the first use is like 80% of the impact you're going to get. So when people say it's over oak, that could mean that there's too many new barrels on that wine. So for us, we do about 40% new. That seems to be a good balance. You could do 100% new oak if you wanted to. You'd end up with a lot more oak influence, obviously. And then the other factor that can go into that is the toasting level. So if you have heavily toasted barrels, you're going to get more impact from that. And then again, different forests can have a greater or lower impact mostly, I think, due to the width of the grain. So we have tighter grain barrels versus wider grain wood. So we kind of try to work with lower toast levels, tighter grains, and not too high a percentage of new oak to try to manage exactly that, so we don't end up with something that's over oaked.
Sounds like you need a lumberjack in your in the winery. So
yeah, definitely. I actually got to visit one of the forests in France a few years ago. Cooper set up a trip and got to see them actually take down one of these 200-foot oak trees, which is pretty amazing to see.
Yeah, cool.
I think we have time for a question for you. I actually had a question. Oh, maybe we don't. That's okay. I'll get it to you on the next round. Here's Bruce and Alan. So let's talk to you.
Go ahead, Dan. If you've got a question for Dr. Gupta, go ahead.
Well, I'm very hesitant to try to draw any parallels between what I do and what Dr. Gupta does, because there obviously is no comparison. But something that you said when we were kind of all meeting earlier this week stuck with me, and I wanted to ask about it, which was, you had mentioned, I think, and you can totally tell me I'm way off base with this interpretation, but I think you had said that having successful surgery strategies or really understanding how to use surgery can help reduce the amount of chemical intervention that's needed for treatment. And I was wondering if that's true, and if you could expand on that a little bit. And I have a connection to the wine industry. Right?
Yeah, no, it's the connection of the wine industry. Well, it's interesting. I think I actually have a lot of colleagues in my department who are, love wine and get into it. I think there's a technical aspect to it, that is, and maybe not just technical, there's like attention to detail, right? And so obviously what you're talking about is all of these factors that are important to, have an amazing product, that you can drink and enjoy. But the steps involved are there's hundreds, if not thousands, and that attention to detail ultimately, I think, lets in your line of work end up with a product that people really enjoy. And I think for me, the part of the people joke about a lot of us are pretty OC in terms of obsessive about things, and I think part of that is that attention to detail has its own sort of reward. Like you focus on something, you spend a lot of time on it, and if you do it right, you end up with something that you're happy with. And I think that obviously it's very different, a bottle of wine, surgery for a patient, but on a introspective level, what you're doing and the reward you're getting from it is knowing that you've done a job to the best of your ability, right? And that's important. I think that one of the things we just had a few minutes, but one of the major predictive factors for a lot, if not all, pediatric brain tumors and a lot of tumors in general, is if we can get the whole tumor out. That seems self-evident, but if there's small amounts of tumor that are left that are not visible, we do have other ways of treating it, radiation and chemotherapy, but those all have long-term effects. And so, even though the first goal is cure and survival, we have a big challenge in the sense that a lot of patients will get what we call adjuvant therapy, radiation, chemotherapy, and we sometimes are quite successful with that. The patients live with the consequences of those treatments for forever. And so I think even though surgery is still our mainstay, and I think the successful surgery still means good news for the patient. In the long run, I think we're looking for treatments and therapies that reduce the disabilities that patients and families have to live with.
Yeah, and so that's what really I got me thinking about it. Is so I kind of spent the earlier part of my career learning how to make the wine, and then the last few years thinking a lot more about grape growing and the vineyard itself. And one thing that I've really focused on is this idea of kind of limiting the inputs and not using synthetic chemicals, so organic farming. And I was just thinking, like, the best analogy that I could make was thinking about how I'm sure when you have to use chemotherapy, those chemicals have the effect that you want, and then they have a lot of other effects that you don't want. And that's what happens in the vineyard. You can use chemicals to kind of treat the pest or the whatever it is that you're trying to eliminate, but the side effects and the extra effects can have a very detrimental effect on your soil, on the plant itself. And so I just got me thinking of that, really reducing that reliance on chemicals where you can't control the secondary effects, was the best I could come up with to compare the two.
We'll take it. Take that analogy. Yeah. So
Yeah, and look, my humble contribution to this conversation would be, my observation is that both endeavors are a combination of science and art, right? So there's an underlying science that really is fundamental to both brain surgery and to winemaking. And you can have the science part down. I mean, that's teachable and learnable and retainable. But unless you have the art, unless what distinguishes the great winemakers and the great brain surgeons of the world is the art, it's the skill they have with their hands, it's their ability to actually transfer that science into something tangible, whether it's a wine product or it's a great surgery. And I think, humbly, I'd say today, we're in the presence of two guys who are actually are not only foundational at the science part, but great at the art part, and we're exceptionally grateful, particularly in Alan's case, to have been on the receiving end of somebody who has great hands and can transfer that knowledge into a great surgical outcome. So thanks for that, Alan. Yeah,
we're on the receiving end of some also a great effort here. So cheers to that.
Absolutely. We had a couple of other questions. Here's one that I'm going to riff off because there is a parallel to George here. So the question was really, Dr. Gupta, taste and smell is so important to enjoyment of wine. Which part of the brain processes these senses? And before you answer that, one of the side effects that George had from his surgery was he lost, half of his olfactory nerve on one side of his nose, right? And that kid has such an incredible sense of smell. So he must have retained, I don't know if the part that he retained became more sensitive, right, or if he just retained the dominant side of his nostril, because I think in winemaking they say we all have a dominant side, but he has such an acute sense of smell. So that's the question.
Yeah, it shouldn't make any difference. If you lose one, we have two olfactory nerves, one on either side, and if you have one side of your nose is stuffed up, the other side should work just fine. Now, whether losing one side kind of heightened that sense or whether he just had it anyway, I do think that most of what we do when we're taste is just very limited. It's sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. That's it. And it's whereas smell is what gives you, your real appreciation of flavor, because it's thousands and thousands of overlapping things that give you a total sort of sense of, in this case, Chardonnay or Rosé or whatever. But I do think that there are actually people, and I think the analogy, it's not a good one, it's probably like pitch. There are people that we all hear, and yet there are people that have a much better ability to discern auditory sounds, music, pitch than other people. And I think the sense of smell is probably heightened in some people and not in others. And whether George has that anyway, that's good. I was actually got a question for Dan. I can ask it, and he can answer it later. Is what people like, smell and flavor is very subjective, right? My kids, one of my kids really has a sweet tooth, enjoys sweet things. The other one likes savory things, doesn't like sweet things that much. And, it's so subjective what people like and don't like. And I've always been curious as to how much that plays into how people enjoy and appreciate wine, because obviously they're totally it is a purely subjective thing, right? There's two kinds of wine, right? The kind you like and the kind you don't like. But, how does that, how do you, when you talk to people about your wine, I'm kind of curious how that plays into people's appreciation of it.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case, that each person, has their personal taste. And then also I think different sensitivities, I think we all know someone, in my case, it's my mom, who sort of fits into that, they call it a super taster category, which sounds good, but it's almost actually bad because you're very sensitive to kind of bitter flavors. And I think that's just very personal. I think you can tell a lot if you ask someone, do you like coffee and do you like it black or with cream? You can tell a lot about their palate from that. And then, as you said, when you get into specific flavors, it starts to get really personal. What I think, there's sort of a drinking wine for enjoyment for me, where that it matters what I like. And then there's the professional side of drinking and tasting technically, where I think what I'm looking for is quality in a more objective sense. It's always going to be personal, but I think where it's a little more objective is the wine rich, not necessarily big, but is it dense? Does it have a lot of dense flavor to it, or is it watery and thin? Is the wine, technically correct? Are there faults? And hopefully at our level, at kind of the premium Chardonnay and Pinot, you're never going to have a faulted wine, but you never know. So I think that I try to deal with that by having with DONO a wide range of wines. So we make up to 11 different Pinot Noirs from just 3 vineyards. And each one of those is made in a little bit different style. And what I try to do is I want the quality of all of them to be here up high, and really someone can recognize this is a quality wine, but maybe this bottling is a little more to your personal taste than that one. And so I think that it's sort of important to separate the two. They will often say, like, any wine you like is a good wine, but a wine that you don't like is not necessarily bad. It might be bad, but I think it's important to sort of be able to separate if you're in the industry. As someone who's drinking wine, you should drink what you like and not worry about anything else. But for us, we need to be able to taste for quality first, and then kind of personal taste second.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the hardest things for people who aren't, I think I'm an amateur when it comes to this, is that separation of, what makes a wine high quality, and then being able to pick that out and then find the kind of flavors and tastes that you appeal to you, that you really enjoy, which is obviously totally subjective. So.
Definitely.
So we've got a few more questions. We thought we'd actually hold them for the next transition. We wanted to acknowledge that we've got over 200 viewers connecting from over 24 states in the United States today's event, which is extraordinary. So thanks to everybody for joining, and we've got a few additional shout outs we'd like to make.
Let's see, we've got Kelly and Chris, an extended family in North Carolina. Thanks for making the join in. We've got PNOC PIs and doctors, Dr. Huang, Dr. Klein, Dr. Reddy, Dr. Lundy, and Dr. Bendel. Sarah and Scott in Connecticut, Heather in Colorado, Lisa and Jace in Kansas. We also have some friends here locally, Barbara and Steve, Tracy and Richie, Christine and Matt, Sarah and Leslie, Jennifer, John, Pam, Matt, Jocelyn, Mike, Janet, Craig, Liz, Matt, Wendy. Thank you all for joining. We also have advisory council members, Rob and Amy and Christine. And then we're also getting some amazing donations just coming online now. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Darren and Shannon. Thank you, Leslie. And thank you, Kevin and Diane. Really appreciate it.
So while you pour your next wine and prepare for the Carneros Pinot tasting, here's a short video about the critically important work of Pinot.
Ice, ice.
1, 2.
Ice, ice.
Frankie was diagnosed
Ice, ice.
in 2016. Within a week, we knew that it was a really rare brain cancer.
One of the hardest things is the oncologist telling us that some parents choose not to go into treatment and just go home and call it a day. And that's why I realized the severity of the situation.
Many of these patients have many therapy options, but very few of them are successful for any length of time.
These families, these children, they don't have time.
PNOC was actually formed to bring clinicians and researchers together to do high-risk, high-reward types of therapy for these children.
Trying to develop new therapies for children with brain tumors, for which the majority of patients we really haven't developed a good standard. As a community, we need to have this strong sense of urgency.
The mandate is accelerated discovery. It's not just making new discoveries, but making them often and faster.
The first small bit of relief that I had is when we were in UCSF and Dr. Mueller came in.
We felt like we were in really good hands with her because she obviously had done a lot of research.
The goal in pediatric cancer and pediatric brain tumors in particular is not just to cure the patient, although of course that's a premium goal, but also to cure the patient and allow them to have the long-term quality of life that they deserve, which means we need to find more effective therapies, but we also need to find safer, less toxic therapies.
What's remarkable about PNOC is the speed at which they can move, how fast they can keep up with innovation, and how much they value bench-to-bedside research using the most cutting-edge discoveries that have been coming out of labs across the country.
They don't have a cure for what he has, but we're not going to give up. And having everybody support us helps a lot. He tells me every day, I just want to be my old self. You know, why can't I be a normal kid?
Without PNOC helping us, we wouldn't have a fighting chance.
It's looking really good now. We're 3 years out, but knowing that there is this research team studying the brain cancer that he had and other brain cancers is really reassuring to me.
Oh, that's my brain!
Yeah.
Knowing that all the greatest doctors are getting together and talking about his specific cancer and other brain cancers is something that actually keeps me going.
So you've heard today that pediatric brain cancer is now the deadliest childhood cancer. But it's not just the lives that we lose to this disease each year, it's the years of life lost. When a child dies, so much promise and potential is stolen from us. And it's estimated that we'll lose 47,000 years of unlived human life in the US this year alone, pediatric brain cancer. I want you to think about that. For the kids that do survive, many will have a very poor quality of life and survivorship. They'll face social and emotional challenges, secondary diseases, and secondary cancers, often due to the physical and cognitive deficits created by the tumor position and the toxicity of treatment. Many kids won't graduate college; they'll be unemployable. It's surviving the tumor is obviously the primary goal, but improving quality of life and survivorship is equally important to us here at PNOC. Pediatric brain tumor research is grossly underfunded, receiving less than 1% of federal NIH funding. And a lack of economic incentive in the private sector has historically further hampered progress. But there is enormous hope. Thanks to a transformative initiative started by Drs. Mike Prados and Sabine Mueller, who were featured in that video, and their unique collaborative approach, PNOC doctors have learned more about the deadliest tumors in the last 5 years than the last 50 years combined. And you heard from Dr. Gupta how those discoveries are being translated directly into personal, patient-centric precision medicine and groundbreaking clinical trials. So your support is making an incredible difference and is now more important than ever. Dan, back to you to raise another glass for this incredibly important cause.
Thank you. Yeah, a little bit hard to follow that video. Really powerful, but I think I guess it just highlights how important this cause is, and we're glad to be able to help a little bit in the way that we can, which is to bring everyone together with the wine, and yeah, really powerful video. So at any rate, let's taste the 2017 Carneros Estate Pinot. So this is our flagship wine. So this was the first wine that DONO ever made. This is really kind of our expression of what Carneros is all about. So as I was talking about earlier, I think any wine should really express the place that it comes from, but specifically Pinot Noir. That's what makes it so amazing. That's why Burgundy is divided up into all these tiny little vineyards, dating back hundreds of years of thought has gone into it, because there really is something when you taste a wine that couldn't come from anywhere else. You taste it in the glass and the place, and hopefully people will, things will get back to normal and people will have a chance to visit and really see this place and then taste the wine. So this is kind of our expression of the Carneros region. So again, it's really close to the San Pablo Bay, which is, an extension of San Francisco Bay. So saltwater, maritime influence. For me, I think what I look for is that a wine of place will kind of have a signature that you taste every year. And our Carneros Pinot, for me, that is a certain characteristic that I call a sassafras, kind of like a root beer sort of aroma that I think is very unique. Nolan, I don't know if you're getting that note or what you're tasting, but for me, that's kind of what I look for. All the berries and fruit of Pinot, a little bit of toast from the oak, but then this kind of saltwater taffy root beer element that I think is really a signature of our property.
Yeah, actually, I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't have come up with the root beer thing, but I'm glad you mentioned it, because now I was looking for it, I think, and so I can definitely tell that it's there. That's a really, really great wine. Again, it has that. Thing I don't like about some of the red wines is that they tend to have great flavor, but then it tends to sit in your mouth and kind of dominate that. This has great flavor, but it doesn't. Very smooth, very, very, very. I don't know. It doesn't leave like a long finish. And is that something that's specific for Pinot, or is that something that you've aimed to do with this particular wine?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because in some ways, like, the finish is really important, and you want a long finish. But I think that a lot of wines have kind of an unpleasant finish, and you definitely don't want that. And that typically comes, I think, with bitterness or high alcohol, or sugar. Again, I think is another thing, which you hope to not have sugar in a red wine, but it does happen. And so I think for me, really, again, that barrel aging period really softens the profile. Tannin is the main thing that gives the wine that bitterness and kind of like drying feeling. And I think like a very overly drying finish can be unpleasant. And so we kind of age it to give it that sort of fullness. And then the finish for me should just be exactly as you said, smooth and pleasant. And it just kind of, it goes, I think the worst thing would be a wine that you have to keep drinking to try to get through the bad flavor at the end. I have a little bit of joke within the family, because my dad was not a wine drinker until I got into the industry, and I think he had, what he had tasted had been some pretty bad stuff. And the first time he tasted my wine, one of my wines, I was sort of like, wow, there's no aftertaste. And I was like, wait, it's a little, but I understood what he meant, like the bad aftertaste. It's like, so exactly that. And I think that comes from really an attention to detail. We don't use any press wine. So once the red grapes and juice are finished fermenting, you still have berries that you can squeeze and get a little bit more juice out of. But that juice tends to be a little more bitter, a little bit more astringent. And so we don't use that in our wine. So we just separate that out. And so I think that really does, you're left with what we call the free run juice, which is kind of the best slice of it, which is really smooth. There you can kind of see in the middle of fermentation on that video how the skins start to break down. The color's not in the grapes anymore; it's actually in the wine. So I think that's key to having that really like kind of smooth, easy finish that hopefully makes you want another sip, as opposed to need another sip.
Yeah, totally. Actually, you raised or you brought up that comment about Burgundy, and in France where they have small vineyards that have been doing it for hundreds of years, but they also believe in blending, right? Like, I mean, like more, I think, in Rhone and in, in Bordeaux. Do you think that, in California, we tend, we tend to use more single varietal types of wines. Do you think that's allows you to focus, or do you think the philosophy of blending wines is something that gives you more creativity in making the wine? I was curious about that.
I do think it really is very dependent on the variety. So certainly, I think with the Bordeaux or Rhone varieties, often there's something to gain, something to be won with blending. Pinot is interesting. It doesn't tend to blend well with any other variety. In some ways, this wine is a blend. It's all Pinot Noir, but it's blended from different pieces of our vineyard. So we tend to think of the blending that way. We're working with 100% Pinot, and I think that's traditional of Burgundy, of course, but then I think also it really is that Pinot tends to work best on its own, and it's such a delicate grape that it's very easily overwhelmed. Just like 2 or 3% of something like a Syrah that's really heavy can really change the profile of the wine. And that certainly does happen, especially kind of on the lower priced wines. Pinot, because it's so thin skinned, needs to be cropped very low, which of course is expensive. And so for some cheaper wines, they might crop it a little heavier and then add something else to try to give it back the body and color that's lacking from that overcropping. But for us, we really want to focus on kind of just making the best Pinot that we can. And the blending is really just across the vineyard. And I think the original idea of DONO when they started was that it would just do this one wine that would be blended from the whole estate vineyard. And what's interesting about Pinot is sometimes it doesn't want to be blended. Sometimes that little piece of the vineyard, and that's where Burgundy gets into the Grand Crus and the Premier Crus that are single vineyards and single source. And that's where our reserve wines come in, which is something we probably don't have time to talk about. But we do a reserve tier, which are those single blocks, just little pieces of the vineyard that really stand out. And it's interesting because in like the Bordeaux variety Cabernet Merlot, typically the top line is still a blend. It's just a specific blend of barrels or portions. For us, the top lines tend to be single little tiny pieces of the vineyard that have this real expression of place. And then with the Carneros, we're expressing a place, but it's a larger place, and it's a little bit different. It's kind of more consistent year to year because of that, because it is blended. But I think that the pinnacle of quality in Pinot is those little tiny slices of a place.
I was actually going to ask you that. How much do you try to maintain consistency for your year to year in terms of your Carneros line, for example? Is that something you try to achieve, or do you work with what you got that year in terms of the grapes?
It's definitely more of a focus on trying to have a consistency of quality as opposed to a consistency of flavor profile. So it doesn't bother me at all and especially on the smaller production little block wines, if they are wildly different from one year to the next in terms of the actual profile, the flavor profile of the wine. But I want the quality to be the best that it can be for that vintage. And of course, in California, our weather is a little bit of a thinner slice. In Europe, you can have huge differences in climate or in weather year to year. We have less of that variation. We still, of course, have it, and subtle changes can make a big difference in the wine. So I don't worry too much about the wine being, having the same flavor profile year to year at all. But I want it to always make the highest quality, and that might mean making a little bit less wine in a tougher vintage, a little bit more in an easier that. And then I love when, like I mentioned, the root beer characteristic on this wine. I think that commonality I really like to see, because that shows that there's something to the vineyard specifically that is showing through. So I think in general, I don't worry about it too much, but I like to see it if it happens.
Great, thanks.
So, a couple of fantastic interaction. I always knew that chemistry between you guys was going to be good. We're up on time, but if you're willing to stay on for another 10 minutes, we've got a couple more questions and a couple of other shout outs we'd like to make. Does that sound feasible to you guys?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Dan, the first thing I'd say is I've actually had this Carneros Pinot a couple of times before, but I think today it's really benefited from, it's been sitting in my glass for about an hour before I drank it. And I mean, it always tasted good, but it actually just tastes phenomenal. So I think that that opportunity for it to air and get some oxidation to it actually definitely has influenced the taste of the wine. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your thoughts?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. Especially these are really pretty young wines. I think of the prime window for drinking kind of starting about 4 years past the vintage date. So we're a little early on these 2017 still. They've been in bottle for about a year and a half. And I think they really need kind of that two to 3 years to start to show their best. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think just like kind of in an intuitive level, when you have the flavor, all of the flavor comes from the interaction between the wine and oxygen in your glass or in the air. And so I think when you have a wine that's kind of been stuck under cork and hasn't seen any oxygen for a while, it really does take a little bit of that interaction. And that's where, you see people really swirling the glass a lot to try to get air in. But there's nothing better than just waiting a little bit. And it's sort of like aging, it's a little different, but it's sort of the same as when you age the wine for a few years in your cellar and let it really develop. By letting it sit in your glass, you're kind of having a little bit of that same effect.
So a couple of questions. We want to do justice to all of these. So first one for Dan. When do you think harvest will be this year? Early, late, usual? When?
It's looking early. Not crazy early, but definitely early. We've had quite a bit of warm weather. We had another drought year, basically, so very little rain after November, December. So that always, with the drier soil profile, that's going to push harvest earlier. So in terms of our rosé and our sparkling wine harvest, I think I'm going to try to get away next weekend because that might be my last chance. And then we might be heading into harvest, I think, within the next couple of weeks. And then the Pinot harvest, I think, will start right around end of August, early September. So we're looking kind of on the early side this year.
Couple of shout outs on the donations. Alan, if you want to
actually we've got a
call
few.
those out. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brian, Elizabeth, Christian, Melissa, and Trish again. And thank you, Matt. We've got all these donations here and feeling incredibly grateful.
Yeah, I'd also like to make a shout out to Kevin and Diane Keenley for their incredibly generous additional donation. Dan, here's another question inspired by Dr. Gupta's earlier comments, and that is there a taste version of the perfect pitch?
Oh, man, that's a good question. I don't know about perfect. I don't know if anyone has a perfect palate, but there certainly is a lot of individual variation. And I do think it is, as you kind of, Bruce talked about earlier, of an element of art to it. I think a big piece of that for a winemaker is the palate part of it. And I don't think I have an especially great sense of smell or anything like that, but I think just to talk about myself, I'm pretty sensitive to what I taste in terms of just kind of willing to go with it and not overthink it. So for me, intuition is kind of a big part of winemaking, of just kind of tasting and reacting and kind of letting things develop, and not overthinking it, not overanalyzing it from a chemistry standpoint, really kind of following the palate. So I think you don't have to have necessarily the most sensitive palate or the most amazing palate, but you need to be willing to listen to your palate and to trust it, I think is really important.
Well, we trust you.
Yeah, we definitely trust your judgment, mate. So we had another question, and that was, what's PNOC's connection to DONO? And I can speak to that. So, Alan and I have been DONO estate members for several years now. I think we were probably early in the vineyard's formation, and we've enjoyed the wines. And we had a connection with one of our board members, Trish Goodman, who's also really good friends with Siobhan O'Connell, who's really, the person who's made today happen with DONO. And I know Siobhan actually shares a special connection with the brain tumor community as well. So we're incredibly grateful for her passion and her support. and for making this all work today. So we're grateful for all of you joining us, and for your generous support. What we'd like to do is raise a glass and propose a toast, hope, progress, and a better tomorrow.
We want to give special thanks to our guests, Dan Fishman and Dr. Nalan Gupta, and again, DONO Estate Winery. And again, just a reminder too that they're kindly extending the access to those PNOC wine sets through July 31st. They're offering that exclusive member for a day benefit, which includes access to those select wines, the reserve and the library, as well as the inaugural vintage of the Blanc sparkling wine. This virtual wine tasting is being recorded, so if you didn't purchase the wines to taste along today, you can still purchase them and then taste it with the video.
We hope we've helped transport you to the wine country today and inspired you to visit DONO Estates in person as soon as you can. We're going to leave you now with more stunning images of the DONO Estate Winery and their world-class art collection. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.